Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about federal finances, the economy, size of government and inflation, wide-ranging economic topics. And to do that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Jerome Gessaroli, Professor of Finance at the British Columbia Institute of Technology and a visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Jerome, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me on your show, Aaron.
Now, Jerome, I thought it might be good to start by talking about the size of the federal government overall. A lot of people are probably aware of the trend of big spending during the COVID-19 pandemic, but maybe you could sort of talk about the overall trend, even before the pandemic, when it comes to size of government and government spending.
Yeah, well, the trend overall for government spending has definitely been to increase year over year, with some minor blips in the interim. And when we talk about government spending, I kind of like to think not just the federal government, but for provincial governments, because cumulatively they add a significant amount of spending and accumulated debts to Canadians also. So the trend has definitely been increasing, and then obviously in the last couple of years, primarily because of the pandemic, the debt load has exploded.
Now, of course, the Trudeau government, they've been in office since 2015. That's 7 years. Every single one of those budgets has been a deficit. I think people might understand that there was going to be a deficit during the pandemic, but what's the explanation for why they have run deficits essentially every year since coming to power?
Well, that's a good question. And the best way I would answer it, Aaron, is that I don't believe that the current government sees deficits as a problem, as an issue. I see they believe there's an opportunity to spend more on different type of social programs and what their priorities are, and they just don't see that there could be a problem going forward and being able to cover the interest costs if interest rates rise, or even if there's needs for spending in other areas in the future. Say there's another pandemic that's just as bad. Will we have the financial flexibility to cover the costs that we'll have to incur at that time?
Well, and so you've answered the question, which I think is a legitimate answer, is that they simply don't think it's important to balance budgets. But I guess I'd put to you then, why is it in fact important to balance budgets? A lot of people argue it's sort of an arbitrary goal. It's a very abstract idea for a lot of Canadians. So why should governments endeavor to balance budgets?
Yeah, well, that's right. And first of all, let me say that not all government deficit spending is a bad thing. Okay, there can be some good investments that the government makes in building infrastructure, building roads, highways, schools, hospitals, things like that. That improves Canada and that builds capacity. But when we borrow for items that are not effective in growing the economy, well, then we're just taking a burden on ourselves. And we will have to pay the money back, not just the principal, but the interest on top of it. And as you know, interest rates vary over time, and interest rates are rising. So the government has borrowed in the last few years based on very, very low interest rates, almost close to zero. And now they're facing where they have to refinance some of their debt, and the new debt that they're taking on, they have to finance it at higher rates. And that's going to be a burden for the government. And when I mean a burden for the government, I mean a burden for all of us, the taxpayers. And the other thing with government spending is that we want to maintain what we call financial flexibility. And that means the ability to borrow more in the future if, as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant emergency, whatever the emergency may be. And we know that there's lots going on in the world that we could see where there may be some significant impact on Canada. So if we borrow too much now, we won't have that financial flexibility to respond in the future.
Okay, these are good points. You're asking governments, Jerome, to plan long term, which is not a good thing, not something a lot of governments are good at. But an interesting point, and I want to pick up this topic of deficits after the break.